One of the things I do in the class I teach at Hunter, the creative writing fiction class, is I copy the opening lines of novels. And I thought, well, since I'm doing this panel, let me type up the opening lines of the works here. And I asked the students what they, when they read the first page, did they draw them in, and did they have a sense of what the rest of the novel was going to promise? I mean, that's what we kind of do. We read at the first pages. And I'm not going to go into the responses they had, but I wanted to ask the panelists this. I would like to invite each of them to read the beginning of their novels, perhaps a page, perhaps a paragraph or two, and then I'm going to ask them how is it they came to open their novels in the way they did. Now, I know some of that is really magical, and some of it, you deliberately set it up that way. But what was it? What was it? What did they have in mind when they began the novel that way? So, I'm going to start with anybody, really. So let me start with Michele Forbes. How about you?
Okay. Can I just say thank you to the Strand and thank you to the Women's National Book Association for having me here tonight. It's a real privilege to be here. I've come over from Dublin, so it's absolutely fantastic. Okay, I shall read the beginning, very short. I'll keep it short, Elizabeth.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Just maybe the first page, and we'll take it from there. I'll say nothing yet, I'll just read. The seal appears from nowhere, an instant immutable presence in the sea, although he must have been swimming silently beneath the surface for some time without her knowing. Catherine shudders in the water. Her thoughts are moving like fast, cold spikes inside her head. Where has he come from? Is he lost? Has he come to feed? The seal's heavy muzzle thrusts toward Catherine. His nostrils, two dark inlets, flare. He is taking in her smell, her fear. His stiff eyebrow hairs, beaded with sea drops, crisscross the thick, shadowy skin of his dark, wide head. Battle-scarred, his snout slopes to an ugly, dull point, where his long, wiry whiskers afford him the seductive familiarity of a family dog. But it's his eyes, the eyes of this wild animal, that terrify Catherine the most. Huge, opaque, and overbold, they hold on her like the lustrous, black-egged eyes of a ruined man. First paragraph.
Can you put down that book? I'll ask the question afterwards. Bernice.
Good evening. I'm very happy to be here with all of these wonderful authors. And I'm glad you all are spending your Wednesday evening with us. Edison Powell, all confidence, with a smile that revealed glittering white teeth, mahogany eyes that sparkled, and long piano-playing fingers. Jazz standards were his favorite. They'd first met over the music, Count Basie's Going to Chicago Blues, spilling out from beneath his fingers, her eyes dead set on his jaw, not blinking, not wanting to miss the clench and unclench of it, or the sudden toss of his head. Curiosity killed the cat, she murmured into her third glass of Chardonnay, after her girlfriends caught her staring at his clenching and unclenching jaw, and the way she trembled when he tossed his head, and that was a dead giveaway that she was more than interested. Her friend whispered to her from behind cupped palms, egged her on, dared her, prodded her forward, with their goading until she found herself almost at his elbow, sandwiched between two women who smelled of vodka and Chanel.
Am I on the money so far? Okay. So let's go to Roxana.
There was a How's this? Can you hear me? There was a change in the engine pitch. The droning roar now turned lower and more purposeful. The plane was changing angle. They were leaving the level flight path, nosing downward. Conrad felt an uneasy drop inside. After a moment, he realized he was bracing himself against the seat, feet pressing hard against the floor as though against brakes. He made himself relax. He leaned toward the window, looking out. Until now, there'd been nothing to see. They'd left Frankfurt at night and had crossed all of Europe in darkness. The whole continent had lain below them, dark as the night sky itself, revealed only by constellations of city lights. By daybreak, they'd been high over the gray emptiness of the Atlantic, far above the miniature waves and the distant, frozen whitecaps. Now they were over land again. Nova Scotia, Newfoundland, anyway, North America. Home ground. Again, Conrad felt the uneasy drop.
My students had a good time with all your beginnings, I can tell you. So then let's go to John.
Well, I just want to say thank you to the Women's National Book Association for having me, and I feel like the need to announce I am a man, actually. I think maybe all my years working as an editor at Cosmopolitan, that's why I'm an honorary woman at this point, I think. Or it's my cleavage, I'm not sure. I'm just gonna read the first paragraph. I named the chapters in this book. It's called What Makes You Afraid. Whenever the phone rang late at night, I lay in my narrow bed and listened. My mother picked up on the first ring so as not to wake my sister if she was home or me. In hushed tones, she soothed the caller before handing the phone to my father. His voice was stiffer, more formal, as he made plans to meet somewhere or offer directions to our faded and drooping tutor on a dead-end lane in the tiny town of Dundalk, Maryland. There were times when the person on the other end of the line had called from a payphone as nearby as Baltimore. A priest, I guessed, had scratched our number on a scrap of paper and handed it over. Or maybe it had been found by simply searching the tissuey pages of the phone book, since we were listed, same as any ordinary family, even if ordinary was the last thing we were.
Did a lot of guessing at the beginning.
No, thank you.
Carolyn.
Okay. Thank you all for coming. Chapter 1, 1956. She came home to find him in her kitchen. She was in no mood, having spent the whole morning arguing with a lawyer. But here he was, her son's best friend, Jimmy Rierson, 12-year-old kid home from school at 3 on a Wednesday afternoon with too long hair and a crush on her, reading all the ingredients on the back of a Duncan Hines Lemon Supreme cake mix, tapping the box with a finger. Adjust temperature for high altitudes, he said, as if it really mattered. She felt a pang for him, a boy so lonely he feigned interest in how many eggs and how much sugar a cake might need. He leaned over and turned on a radio, and there was Elvis crooning Heartbreak Hotel, the words splashing into the kitchen. "How'd you get in here?" Ava asked, reaching over to turn down the music. No one except for her locked doors in the neighborhood. She had her kid wearing a key around his neck like an amulet. Other kids were allowed to run free to wander in and out of everyone else's houses, something Ava could never quite get used to. It wasn't that she had anything to steal. Truthfully, she had so much less now. But still, there was Brian, miles away, breathing down her neck with a custody threat, telling her he got a lawyer and she'd better get one too, because he was going to file to revisit their agreement. But in fact, she had started locking her doors the moment the movers left, 2 years ago, and maybe that was what made the neighborhood suspicious. Thank you.
Great. You made a good choice. New York City, the New York chapter of this association made a good choice in all these 4 books. So I'm kind of asking that question because I'm curious myself and hope that you'll be curious. I want to ask all of these panelists, how did they come about this, the beginning of their novels the way that they did? And why did they? How did it work for them? And maybe I could start with, I'll tell you sort of what happened to me when I was reading your story. Bernice, you shocked the heck out of me when that novel proceeded, because I was so certain One, I said, boy, Bernice is fantastic with giving us this character here. I was so sure he was a certain person. And then all of a sudden you flipped the switch on me. And of course I had to read more.
Well, actually, just so everybody understands, I don't write in order, so the beginning of this book was probably somewhere in the middle when I first started writing it, and it's been a while. This book was first published in 2006, so I probably finished it in 2004. And it's very quickly, it's basically two stories in one. It's a present day story and a past. And so we have Sherry, who is traveling from Nevada to Georgia with her mother, and the mother is telling her the family history, and Sherry is then piecing it together into a novelized version. But Sherry has had all of these problems. She's a very rootless woman, and she's just searching. And so the story opens up with her, Sherry is black, and her white boyfriend, and what happens from there. And I thought that it was important to put Sherry at the forefront of the story when the book opened, so we could get a better sense of who she was, this searching, journeying person.
Well, since you sort of gave it away by saying that Sherry had a white boyfriend, I was so sure that man that she was looking at, because of all the things, he was a musician, he was a jazz player, and you were portraying him in the way that my expectation was. And then, what did it mean that he wasn't black? What did that mean, and what was the significance to the rest of the story? And I think it's really interesting when a writer does that. They change our, well, I don't want to use the word comfort zone, but they change our expectation, they change the stereotypes that we may have in our heads, and then we are swept into the writer's vision. And actually the same thing happened to me with Michele's book. Oh, you heard us read that beginning. Coming under that water with that woman. And is it real? Isn't it real? How does it fit into the story? What was the...
Well, actually, Elizabeth, the beginning of Ghost Moth came very late in the process.
Oh, like Bernice?
Yeah, absolutely.
That's a question I'm also interested in. How does it...
I think it's a question of when you realise the momentum of the story you need to bring the reader in, really. Actually, not only the beginning of the story came late in the process, but the main character came later in the process, because I had started with Elsa the daughter, and it was looking at the world through her eyes, a 9-year-old girl. And very briefly, like Bernice, I have 2 time frames within the novel. It's set in Belfast. It opens in 1969, just on the cusp of what we now know as the Troubles. And it was a period of, the political landscape was shifting dramatically. We had civil rights marches, both in Belfast and Derry. And then I scooped back to 1949. And the reason why I did that was because the protagonist, Catherine, became more and more important. She was a shadowy figure to begin with, and she just intrigued me more and more. What was her story? What was her backstory? But the episode of the seal was drawn from real experience, in the sense it wasn't me in the water, but I was out for a walk with friends of mine, and I live near the coast. We have seals coming in. This was a bathing place where there were seasoned swimmers, and we actually ended up having to rescue a woman from the water, and the seal, we could see the seal right beside her disappearing. Every time he disappeared, it was more intimidating than when he was actually visible. But it was the sound she was making, the terrifying sound she was making, which it just stuck with me. So I felt I had to use this, and consequently someone had written to me saying, oh, you've used the image of the seal, which in Celtic mythology is is all about the selkie. The selkie apparently is a seal which appears to a dissatisfied woman, and I had no knowledge of this. So that came over the left shoulder somewhere subconsciously, so that it was very helpful when I learned that.
It works so well in the rest of the novel.
Yes, and also someone said to me, the seal doesn't appear again, but he does.
Yes, he does.
Yes, he does. Yeah,
absolutely does. Yes, yeah. Okay, so then let's go to Carolyn.
Well,
before you, I'm taking a breath here to speak.
okay.
I'm trying to think of, because you set us up right away in the beginning. I mean, there is that 13-year-old boy. I'm asking my students, what do they think? I made them really visualize this scene, and sort of, she's so specific. They're making a Duncan Hines Supreme cake, right? And he seems a bit, you almost know what, you don't know almost know, but you can, you're intrigued enough to go on to say what's happened, but go ahead.
Well, 3 pages into the novel, this little boy vanishes. So I felt it was really important to focus on all the terrible things that didn't have to do with this boy at all. So my first few pages, I wanted to really focus on Ava and her problems with a ex-husband who wants custody, and she comes home and there's this strange boy who has a crush on her in her house, and what is she going to do with him? And there's all these specifics of the time, and they're making this packaged cake because it's part of the time. And I wanted to focus on that and pull away from this boy and make it seem that he's just this happy-go-lucky kid, because the last thing you see of him is that he smiles at her and he waves, and then you never see him again for the rest of the book. And I just liked doing it that way, because when I was writing it, it made me feel very creepy, and I thought if it made me feel that way, maybe it would make other people feel that way as well.
Talking about creepiness, let's get to the John.
You call me creep.
The set, that part of what I was saying, my students when I was reading that also was how you use the setting also to set up that the beginning of the story. I mean, it was a Tudor house. Yeah. It was in a certain part of town. It was, just everything just worked for the school course.
Well, thank you, Effie. I started this book with a late night phone call, and I realized I started Strange But True, my last book with a late night phone call, so my agent said I've used my quota with late night phone calls. But I realized, whose phone hasn't rung in the middle of the night, and you instantly are like, what's wrong, who's dead? Years ago, when I got it at NYU, I had written a novel, and I'd sent it to a friend of a friend who worked at the publishing house, and they sent it back with a very polite letter saying they didn't like it. When I pulled it out, there was this little scrap of paper that was left in the box, and it was mistakenly left in with the manuscript, and it said I could barely make it to page 60, and I feel really sorry for anyone who has to read the whole thing. And I still have it, as sure I'll tell you. And but actually, I always joke I was very Downton Abbey, but I took to my bed. I was like, I'll never write again. But then, it taught me something that I just was like, I never want anyone to have that experience reading something I write or have written. So I always try really hard to create a question in the reader's mind from the very start. Mm-hmm. And with Strange But True in this book, it's been starting with a late night phone call. Mm-hmm. And then very quickly you realize their family is not an ordinary family. The parents have this unusual occupation that priests give out their number. Yes. So there's little bits of information right away. You're wondering who's calling, what's their job, why is this girl, the narrator, we find out is a girl laying in bed listening at night to this phone call, why is she so intrigued? And my hope is that it propels the reader to keep reading too.
And with my background with Catholicism and exorcism and all of that, mentioned priests, and I'm in.
You're in.
Roxana's novel, as that guy, he comes in that plane coming down to the U.S. and what she does with it afterwards. It's an extraordinary novel. I read it much before it was selected for this group. I had already read it, and it just stayed with me. It's a novel for today, part-time. So, Roxana, what's your novel about? Why did you start it that way?
Okay, so 2 questions. The beginning of it, for some reason, the beginnings of my novels never change. I rewrite everything else 150,000 times. Every sentence is written 70 or 80 times, but the opening paragraph is usually it's fixed. That's how I come to the book, and that's my entrance. And so it becomes your entrance. So I can't tell you where this opening came from. That was how I found my way into the book. But the idea for the book came 6 or 7 years ago. I don't know exactly when, but I read an article in the New York Times on the front page about our troops in Iraq. And this became common knowledge, but this was the first time I had seen this fact, that we were sending the troops out in unarmored vehicles over bomb-studded roads, and they were being blown up and suffering from traumatic brain injuries. And they were reluctant to admit this, but when they did seek treatment, the military medical didn't want to acknowledge that they'd had brain injuries because A, it was expensive to treat them, and B, it meant removing combatants from the field. And I'm a Quaker. I had never been in favor of going to war in Iraq. I'd never voted for Bush. But I thought that once we went, since we were the greatest military power in the world, that we would send people with the best equipment. They would have the best machinery and everything, and we would support them. And when I found that none of that was true, I was so appalled that I started reading everything I could find about what it was like to be a soldier on the ground in Iraq, and then what it was going to be like to come home. So this is a book about coming home. Some of it takes place in Iraq, but most of it is what it's like to make that change from warrior to civilian, and if it's possible. That's the question.
It's a riveting book, I can tell you.
Thank you.
It makes you angry and sad and everything, a whole bunch of feelings together. One of the quotes that I also use is a quote by Woody Allen. And he talks about, I'm just going to sort of paraphrase, he was asked this question that Picasso said, which is that he is a big thief. That's what Picasso says. And Woody Allen's response to that said, I'm even a bigger thief. I have stolen from Groucho Marx, I've stolen from Keaton, I've stolen from this, I've stolen from Fellini. I am a shameless thief, is how he ends what he says. So I began thinking, what exactly does he mean by that? Do writers have something that is similar to what Picasso says for painting and what Woody Allen said for his films? I guess it boils down to what are the influences? What are your literary influences? And to what extent is your writing shaped by these writers? There's a writer I know that I'm very fond of. He says to me that whenever she is, you can hear me in the back. Whenever she's writing a novel, she doesn't read. Now it's the opposite for me. When I'm writing, I'm just surrounding myself with books, mostly for encouragement, to know that somebody else filled a blank page, somebody else knew how to move a scene to a scene and to do dialogue and stuff like that. But sometimes for inspiration, and sometimes kind of Woody Allen, Picasso style. So I want to ask this panel, who are their literary influences, and in what ways have these writers shaped their work? And you can start any way you want, or I can call on you. Anybody want to start?
I'll start.
Yeah.
Toni Morrison is a big influence, and when I sit down to write, like you, I have all of her books spread around. It's something about her writing that just really moves me, and moves me to write, and moves me to become a better writer. The past few years I've found that I turn to poetry a lot now, because that really moves me as well. So Rita Dove is a big influence, and there's another person that her name is escaping me. It'll come when I get home. I just the turn of a phrase, and of course, there's this I don't want to call it envy, but I'll take a line and try to make it my own. It's like, well, she did it this way or he did it that way, and this is such a lovely line. How can I make it mine or make it better?
You know, I had that feeling in reading the business New Yorker did a reprint of Alice Munro's short story, The Deer Went Over the Mountain, which was published in 1999, and they published it again. And I read that on Saturday, and today is Wednesday. And that short story is just haunting me. But when you said, kind of like jealousy, or I don't know how this woman took these words, not too many words. It's just not too many words she's playing with to make a sentence and to let you know you have to do that story. So I know what you mean. You mean there's a sense of awe and a sense of, my God, how the heck they did that? Can I do it? And you have to pull yourself up again because you're right there. What about your influence?
Well, I guess I should add too that I feel a little bit of a blow-in because I'm no spring chicken, and I've come to this process late, and this is my debut novel, but my background is in theatre, so my influences really would be people like Brian Friel, Michael Harding, Marina Carr, playwrights who I have worked with and whose words would have sustained me night after night after night in a performance. And how do they put those words together, and how do I interpret that? So when I came to write this, I guess that was always in the back of my mind, something which would have weight and have worth and sustain. That was my thing. But funny you should mention Alice Munro. She would be right there on my desk. And how she does it, I mean, I read her, and she just brings you there, and then that one sentence gets you. And Nettles for me is my story, my Alice Munro story, and I remember reading it on the train and just getting to that point where she talks about love being unusable, that phrase, and of course she leads you there by the hand and you don't even see it. But she would certainly be a big influence, and Richard Ford I absolutely have fallen in love with. So so they're voices that are in my head to kind of keep me going, make me work harder and try and make it better.
Do you find yourself imitating their styles?
Well, I mean, in a way, that's the thing, isn't it? You want that sense of independence and make it your own, but certainly in terms of keeping in touch with that inspiration, to keep rereading them, I think is and hopefully you'll find your own path with that,
What about you, Karen?
Richard Yates and actually John Irving, not just because I feel that his fiction has a moral component and also tells a good story, but because of this one thing he said about writing, where he said, when you're writing, if you don't feel like you're on the edge of humiliating yourself, then you're not trying hard enough. And he said, if you don't feel like what you're writing is way beyond what you can do, then why bother doing it? I loved this quote so much that I tracked him down, and I wrote him a letter, and I told him how much that quote meant to me, and he wrote me back this letter, and he said, Dear Miss Leavitt, I had to read your letter twice because I had to make sure you were the only person who never asked me for anything. And he said he didn't really remember saying that quote, but he said it sounded like something that he said. So I have that posted right over my computer. It's just totally inspirational.
Yes, but what happens when you feel that, does it bring you down?
No, it doesn't at all. And it's exactly the opposite. To know that writing is hard and that it's supposed to be hard, and that's part of the pleasure and the joy of it, it's exhilarating. It pulls myself up. I look at that quote and I think, if John Irving feels that, then who am I to like that?
That's why I surround myself.
Yeah.
Because I think if they can do it,
right.
I can, What about you, Roxana? Who are your influences?
The influences, the writers that taught me how to write would be a long line of sort of Anglo-American writers. Jane Austen, the Brontes, Virginia Woolf, Henry Green, I loved, Elizabeth Taylor, Elizabeth Bowen. And then in this country, John Updike was really my hero. And if I can write, it's because of reading John Updike. So that was sort of my background. But then I always find that when I'm writing a book, I choose one book that becomes the book for my book. And so that's the book that's on my desk, and I read it often over and over, just a few pages before I start to write, just to remind me of something that can be done, some voice that I want to hear. And they've been quite different. When I wrote This Is My Daughter, I was reading the journals of John Cheever. And so those were wonderful. You can just read 3 pages and find a discrete passage. And then when I wrote Sweetwater, for some reason I was reading that it was when the new translation of Anna Karenina came out, and I read that, which lasted a long time, and then which was great because it takes me a long time to write a book. And then when I wrote Cost, I was reading Michael Cunningham's The Hours, which was sort of Virginia Woolf channeled through an American man, and it was a wonderful, wonderful book. And I read that so often, and so I knew exactly what passage. If I could open it to any page and know exactly where I was. And it was interesting. Somebody reviewed that book and said how much she could feel Virginia Woolf's presence in it, and it made me feel very strange because I was trying to channel Virginia Woolf, but I was doing it through Michael Cunningham, so it felt as if we were part of this crazy incestuous little family. But of course, I was thrilled to hear someone say that she could feel Woolf's presence. And in this book, because it's about war and because it's about a soldier and because I've never been a soldier, I've never been at war in Iraq, I read over and over the passage from Ian McEwan's Saturday, in which the soldiers are gathering at Dunkirk. And that's, I think, one of the great pieces of war writing. And Ian McEwan has never been in the war, and he wasn't at Dunkirk. But it's a beautiful piece, very powerful and vivid kind of fictional reportage of an actual event, and it's dazzling. So that too, I became extremely familiar with. Oh, sorry, it's not Saturday, it's Atonement. Sorry. I like Saturday better than I like Atonement, but I love that one. Yeah, we can talk. But that passage in Saturday is, I think, brilliant. So that became my reminder of how to get into a soldier's mind in a place I had never been.
Well, I tell you, Roxana, all the books you mentioned, all the books I read over and over.
Oh, really?
As a matter of fact, I just recently reread Hours.
Oh, it's so good.
The beginning of that novel is just plain genius.
It is. It's a dazzling book.
Just the steps, one after the other, takes you right down to the river.
Yeah.
And my problem with Atonement is that whole scene in Dunkirk. I just felt like it's a novel inside of a novel. That's how I felt about Atonement.
Yeah, I don't love that book. It's not my favorite book. There are many reasons I don't admire it as much as Saturday, but that passage I think is brilliant.
Yeah. Let me go to you. Before I go to you, let me just say, for me, what I mean about the beginnings of novels, I just happened to open The Maid's Version by Worrell, the man who wrote Winter's Bone. Good Lord, I don't remember his face name. Anyhow, I was just in a bookstore, I started reading it. And it was just like 2 hours. I was still sitting down there reading it. So I had to go pick up the book, and then I wrote to you. And I said to Bernice, go get this book. And then I just told, but I have to say, the end just didn't quite get me. But this is what to me, a novel that draws you in like that. I think he was trying to do something like Olive Kitteridge. What Elizabeth Stroud did in If I had to guess, that's what I had to do. And you're right about Cost. Now, when you said that, you're right about Cost. You do feel Virginia Woolf. You are absolutely right about that.
Thank you.
Absolutely right. What about you?
feel like my answer is not nearly as academic as these people, but or just so you have Virginia Woolf. When I was a kid, my dad was a cross-country truck driver, and in the summers, my parents would send me trucking with my dad to quote "make a man out of me." And I guess now that I'm on this women's panel, they've gotten their wish. But anyway, on those trips, it was actually sort of boring after a while, and so I would take my mom's Sidney Sheldon paperbacks with. My mom had a Sidney Sheldon obsession, and as a 9-10-year-old boy, I was reading The Other Side of Midnight, which was probably not the intended audience. But then after I kind of exhausted those, I would go into the truck stops, and they had those mass market carousels, and my dad would give me money, or if I had money, I would buy Stephen King. And I read The Shining one summer, that yellow, remember that thick yellow one? I read that one summer on one of those trips. And then I started reading, when I got a little older and would go on those trips, I would read John Irving. So I always joke that Help for the Haunted is this weird combo of Stephen King's creepiness, John Irving's quirky characters, and Sidney Sheldon's plot twists. It's a weird combo, but there you go. Yeah. So.
Are you reading when you're writing?
Yeah. I mean, I always read because I do go on television and talk about books, and for years I was a book editor at a women's magazine. So I'm always part of my job, part of my life. When I show up at home, there's a mountain of books on the doorstep waiting for me, and so I'm always reading and looking through books. And I don't have that problem of I can't read while I'm writing. Like you, I find it really inspiring to look at books. But this is an interesting concept to me, to look at one book in particular. I like that idea. It was interesting.
She's kind of like my soul sister here, because I do that.
You do that too? Wow.
I can tell you, for Anna in Between, the novel I was reading was Disgrace. Katsia, the biggest Katsia style.
Such a good book.
I was looking at Katsia style all the way. So I want to turn it over to you for you to ask questions, but I have about 10 more minutes here. A question I want to ask them. It's kind of a mundane one, but tell me something a little bit about your writing habits. How do you go about writing? Do you do things like you set a certain time, you write certain number of words, how do you go about doing it? And I see Bernice is looking at me, because I know Bernice is asking. She's ready to challenge me on that question. So I will go to someone. Michele.
Well, I guess when I get, I'm now working on the second book, and this was a big learning curve for me in trying to set up a routine, if you like, because I will still do theatre work. But when I get those stretches where I can settle down and work, I do keep to a routine as much as possible. I will always walk. That's how I start my writing process. I walk because I just find things land and click, and it's like, the game Tetris, where the little pieces kind of fall down and just click in. If I don't walk, I don't really get that in the morning, so I do the same route around by Killiney and up Killiney Hill, and about 10-15 minutes into the walk, I normally pass by the convent school, and something kind of happens there. Those little things start to fall in, so I tend to get my ideas behind the convent wall mostly. That's the way it happens. But I get back to my desk then and just try and get as much as I can down. Those first few hours are precious, really, for me. The afternoon, I'll rework stuff, and if I can read that night, that's fine. But family life is busy, but that's okay too.
The morning.
So the morning for me is the time. Yeah.
What about you, Caroline?
My husband and I live in a big old 3-story house, and so we have a very long commute from the second story to the third story for our office. And I'm basically there all day until about 3 o'clock when we break to have lunch or go to the movies. There's a quote about writing, I think it was Doktorov, where he said, writing is like you're on a road and you can only see a little bit ahead. But I sort of push it where I can't really see ahead, but I know my destination, which means I spend about 6 months before I start writing a book doing what I think is a sort of outline, a structural outline. So I know the beginning of the story, I sort of know the middle, and I sort of know the end. And of course, as I'm writing, I will rip that up and rewrite it about 25 different times. But that's my lifeline. As long as I have that piece of paper beside me, I feel I'm not going to drown. And that's my writing day.
I do have another question after this one, so let's move on here. Roxana.
I write first thing in the morning for as long as I can. It depends on.
Every day?
Well, I try to. My hero is John Updike, who said 1,200 words a day, 6 days a week, without exception. It's good. It's not it's what I aspire to. It's not what I achieve, but that's what I try to do. So even if I can't write 1,200 words of fiction, I try to write 1,200 words of something, nonfiction, an essay, something. But that's. If in the beginning of a book, writing fiction is something I can't do all day. I maybe can write until 12 or 1 or 2. The further I get into a book, the more time I can spend on it. So at the end, I can be writing all day and in the middle of the night. Although the one nonfiction book I did, O'Keeffe, by the end of that, I was writing about 20 hours a day. I was writing all day, all night. I stopped going to the dentist. I stopped going to the bank. I stopped brushing my teeth. I stopped jogging. I stopped cooking dinner. My husband would call and say, dinner's ready, and I'd come down and eat, and I'd go back upstairs. And I'd work until I fell asleep, and I'd wake up in the middle of the night and say, 1928. She wasn't there in 1928. It was 1929. You got it wrong. Run down the hall, fix it. But in the beginning of a book, I can only sit for a couple of hours, and I don't know where I'm going. And I don't work with an outline. I start out with a novel with a problem and a set of characters, and they create where we go. They create the plot.
Scary.
It is scary, yeah.
What about you, Tom?
Each book's been a little bit different. For Strange But True, I had this idea. I've been writing this book for a long time, and I would fall asleep while I was writing it, which is a bad sign if you're the writer and you're falling asleep. So during that hellish process of years, I was taking the subway home one night from the magazine, and I had this idea on the subway, and I went home and frantically wrote out in the bathtub every night on 23 pads of paper in 3 weeks. I wrote a very rough first draft of a novel, but then I spent a year revising. And then this book, I started it at a writer's colony, sort of, and truly started it. And then I would go to the NYU library all the time. It's like I treated it like office hours. I would go every day that I was not at the magazine. And one night I was delirious, during the revisions, and I stumbled out. I realized I hadn't eaten in forever. And I remember I sat down at this restaurant, Otto, however you say that, just sat down at the bar, and then who sits next to me but this book publicist I know from pitching me books, and she was with Jay McInerney, but I looked like a homeless person. I was my clothes were ripped, I hadn't showered. It's like, this is Jay. And they were all swanky, and I looked crazy. But anyway, so I locked myself in the library.
Sometimes readers don't realize the amount of research a writer has to do to create a fiction, create a world that they have created. So I wanted, as my last question, to ask each of you to...
I don't. Because she knows in her head.
No, I know the answer. She's gotten me nervous about the answer. Go on.
What is it? That I don't write every day? Is that the one?
No,
that
the way you...
I write out of order? That I don't outline? Which one is it? I don't know what it is. All right, so I don't write every day. I write out of order. I don't outline. The characters come, and I listen to them. And I listen to them for a few years. It takes a while. The physical writing part takes me about a year. But my process is this. I nest. It's like right before you have a baby and you're cleaning like a lunatic. This is what I do, because I can't be distracted. If I sit down and write and I look over, it's like, oh, there's dust there. It'll take me away from my writing, because the hardest part is sitting down and putting that first sentence on the page. Now, 11 months ago, I sold my house. And I've been bouncing around for a year, almost a year. And so I haven't been in a space long enough to really kind of nest and write. And this is my season to write. I write from September to about April or May. So I'm staying with cousins in Canarsie, and every few weeks I do this big cleaning, and they sit and they just watch me, and I run through the place cleaning, but then I can't write, and then I just sit down. It's not happening for me, but I'm going away in November. Hopefully I'll be able to do it. So that's my process.
I wouldn't know how to hold on to that. So, I think it surprises readers to some degree how much, and because I've had two lives in a way, I've had to do academic research because I've had an academic life, and I actually came to writing pretty late. myself. And it surprised me how much research I had to do for a novel, and I wouldn't say what I do with it, but I wanted to ask you, how much research do you do for a novel, and what do you do with all this research that you have unearthed? Or don't you do research for your novels? I'm going to ask you first.
I did tons of research for This Tomorrow, and it was so much fun. I found all these original video strips from the 50s, including one which was from Look magazine called How Can You Tell If Your Neighbor's a Communist? And here are two ways. One, does your neighbor read a lot of books? He's a communist. Does your neighbor use big words? Communist. I found pamphlets, instructional pamphlets for women, wives in the 1950s about how to be a good wife, which had a lot of tips like always ask him about his day, never tell about your day, make sure you look pretty, because if you don't, he's going to go after his secretary. I found pamphlets from the government on how you could survive a nuclear attack. If you're out in radiation, brush it off. And the more I found, the more I immersed myself in it, I started being in this really hallucinatory state because I couldn't tell, like, what year is this? And it was wonderful. I learned to really love research.
And actually, that's what makes your novel come alive and believable, you know?
Every detail, every detail counts from the littlest thing down.
That, that's what I say to my students. You have to, if you've chosen this year, we have to know what's going on in there. And it has to be believed.
Right.
So what about you, John?
I do a lot of research as well. With this book in particular, it dealt with Catholicism and those sorts of issues. So I looked back at a lot of like the way, in particular, women were treated when they would label things as, quote, demonic possession, when it was obviously anything but. And so just did a lot of reading books of that nature in the library and online.
Now what about you, Roxana? I know you did.
It's not exercising.
I had to do, I actually have found with each book I do more research. I get into areas that I am less knowledgeable about. So this book was, the last book I did involved Alzheimer's, the history of neurosurgery, and heroin addiction, all areas that I didn't know very much about to begin with. So that was a huge educational process. And then with this book, I had to learn everything I needed to know to convince you that I am a 26-year-old Marine lieutenant coming home from Iraq. So it took me 5 years to do the research and to write the book. It was a huge task and fascinating. I read, and it sort of elucidated for me the way civilians learn about wars, and there's a sort of an arc, and the first information we get comes from journalists who are there on the ground. They're not supposed to have a position on it. They're just delivering the facts. They tell you where they are and what happened. So we get these sort of lightning flashes from them. And then we get that for a couple of years, and then you get the first person narratives from veterans who've come back, and they've kept journals, and they have something to say. They want to tell you what it was like for them. They always have a reason for telling you. And so I read those as they started to come out. Some of them were from people who had had a good experience. They brought their platoons home. They'd fought in real fights against people who were shooting against them, and they felt they were doing something good. And then there were people who were so appalled by what was happening while they were there that they became deserters and were arrested and were put in prison, or they were living for the rest of their lives in Canada. So I was having to make sense of this wide spectrum of experience. And then the last thing that happens is fiction. And it was 10 years after the invasion that the first piece of fiction came out. So it made me aware of the fact that fiction comes from a different place, and it delivers a different kind of intelligence, a kind of an emotional intelligence. It comes from some place that has understood it in a different way from the journalists' reports, and we read it in a different way. So I was very aware of all that, and then I did research. I read everything I could find, and I went on YouTube, and there were all kinds of YouTube encounters that people had filmed, plus which the Marines and other soldiers love technology, and so they would write home and ask their moms to give them baby cams, which they would put on their helmets, and they'd go out into a firefight. So you could click on this thing, and you would be in the middle of a firefight in the streets of Ramadi. It was amazing. So I did every kind of research I could, and then the most powerful, the most interesting, and the slowest for me as a process, because it's hard for a civilian to enter into that world, but was interviewing the vets themselves. And that was the most dramatic, the most compelling, and the most moving for me.
I just want to tag on a question to you on that. How much did this cost you psychologically and emotionally? Because it cost me. I was a reader. How much did it cost you?
Well, as I say, it took me 5 years to write it, and it was incredibly challenging. It's the most difficult book I've ever written, for many reasons. Yeah, it cost me a lot to sort of force myself to go to those places I had never been. Really for psychological reasons. To learn what it's like to be a soldier means to understand what it's like to kill. And that's something civilians don't want to know about. I never wanted to know about it. We love our soldiers. They're our sons, they're our husbands, they're our brothers. But they're trained to kill. And sisters. And so that's part of an experience that we don't have here, and we don't want to know about it. And they don't want to talk about it. And it's a huge chasm that separates them when they come home. And I don't necessarily think civilians should know about it, but I had to know about it. And I had to find out what it meant to kill. And I had to explore it in ways that I never thought I would. And I had to think about America's foreign policy and ask veterans how they felt when they learned there had been no weapons of mass destruction, that there was no reason for them to go and watch their friends be blown up. It was a very challenging road. But at the end of it, I don't feel as if I've been diminished by the cost, whatever it was. I feel larger, and I'm glad I did it.
What about you? Yes.
Well, no, I would approach. I approached Ghost Moth in the sense that I had to get the emotional journey of the characters first, and then slot into that what I needed research-wise. It was funny because I've just come down from the Boston Book Festival, and I was on a panel, historical fiction panel, and I was going, I don't write historical fiction. And then I realized, because the two time periods, like 1969, I remember 1969, I was 9 years old then, that can't be history. And yet, of course it is. But it was very important for me to step back into that time, because I left Belfast as a teenager and was very glad to leave Belfast. And so for me, I was working on a movie called Omagh, about the Omagh bombing, which happened. We had the peace agreement signed in April 1998, and in August we had the Omagh bomb, killing 29 people, and the sense of kind of moral disintegration and disappointment was absolutely huge, and that lingered with me in terms of having left Belfast, wanting to emotionally reconnect with the place. But that 1969 period, I focused on very mundane, ordinary detail, while the canvas of the Troubles was beginning. It was on the cusp of that. And I really wanted to believe that in the middle of all of what was going on, there were other stories to be told. And that was a difficult thing to hang on to, but I did, hopefully. The 1949 sections, I worked pictorially a lot. There's a fantastic book, James Barden's book, about Belfast, and just I set those pictures out in front of me when I was writing. And also my father would often feed me with stories of Belfast at that time, and I was just fascinated by it, because it was a city which was vibrant. Cafes were open, restaurants, shops, and it was a very different city to the one that I knew, which was under siege. So I wanted to pit the guises of the city together. But in terms of research, it wasn't huge, but it had to be accurately placed. but the focus really is on the struggle of the married couple who are struggling with a personal trauma, rather than a statement of the troubles itself. So I wanted to keep it.
That's what made your book so powerful, that you have this ordinary domestic thing going on in the background.
Yeah,
there's reference to little slight references, but you get it, right?
I mean, George is the kind of link between the city and the home. He brings news of what's happening back home because he works as a retained fireman, so he sees what's going on. But the family themselves are placed in the margins of the city, and in a way that was to bring focus, as you say, the kind of domestic, everyday things that were going on and what they had to deal with themselves. And I wanted to kind of see if I could lay those ordinary experiences as charges through the narrative to keep the momentum going.
And you did.
So thank you.
And Bernice, what about you?
Well, Nowhere is a Place actually came out of my genealogy research. And usually my stories start with a story from my family. I'm very interested in legacy and my ancestors. And so the research involved had to do a lot with looking through my grandmother's photo albums and paper clippings and Ancestry.com. You could get lost there. I could just spend days and days going through census records, and the characters just kind of jump out of the census records, and they ended up in my book. So the majority of my research has to do with genealogy, and the story just kind of forms around that.
But your most recent book was the Emmett Till story, and
Right.
that was a different kind of research.
Right, that was a different kind. But I still use my family history. When I write about Detroit, I write about the same street, the same house, and the people that live there. That's my family, and so whenever I write about that city, that's what I'm writing about.
Well, as I said, this is a treat. These are some really talented, wonderful writers, and the books that you have chosen, you're really in for a treat to read them. I enjoyed them all. So I want to turn it over to you. You're not hearing me? Oh, okay. Do you have any questions for our panelists? I know you do. Yeah.
How do you determine your titles? And at what point during the process of writing your book does the title come to you? What happens with the title?
Can I answer that?
Yes.
I want to answer this because my last 3 novels had at least 16 different titles. With this particular novel, this novel was first called Everything Happens Today. Everybody hated it at Algonquin. They said, come up with something else, it's not good enough. So I came up with another title, which was, I think it was called Breathe. Nobody liked that one either. Finally, I was looking through and I found, it was in my research, I found a piece of propaganda which was called Is This Tomorrow, which showed all these cowering Americans running where these big, tough Soviet communists were running after them, and I thought, well, maybe that'll work. So I gave that to my editor, and she said, well, I don't hate it. We'll show it to everybody else, and we'll see if it sticks. And it gradually stuck. So for me, titles are usually a marketing thing. I'm really bad at them, and I always assume that they're going to be changed.
Anybody else? Is it always marketing?
Not so much. It's a lot of titles that I like that I think are evocative or fit with the novel. Algonquin would say, well, it sounds like another book, or it's not strong enough. And I never could quite understand why it wasn't strong enough. So I finally just gave up and said,
So the editor is kind of making a decision for you. Anybody else wants to jump on that?
Well, Kate Atkinson, the British writer, she cannot write unless she has a title for her books. She says that has to come first. And it began to worry me because Ghost Moth as a title was floating around, but I hadn't decided on it. And I was kind of halfway through the novel, and it was called Invisible Skin at one stage. But it kept coming back, the motif, the kind of image of the Ghost Moth, and I thread the story through. But it came quite late in the whole process. So
for me, the title comes last. I never know the title until the book is finished.
For me too.
And my editor has no choice.
Oh, you don't give your editor a choice.
No, I do not.
That's interesting. She must be very powerful. That's all there is to it. What about you, John?
This book had a different title the whole time, and then we all kind of liked it in the beginning, and then as I got toward the end, we were kind of sick of it, and we kept tossing around for other titles. And within the book, a writer writes a book about the parents, and it's called Help for the Haunted. And the reason for that is the father originally placed an ad in the newspaper when the parents started their business to help haunted people, and it's called Help for the Haunted. And
So
we used
you
that.
knew that title before?
No, I didn't know that would be the title of my book. It was the title of the book within the book.
okay.
But then we decided to use it.
What about you, Bernice?
This book originally, I wrote it under the title The Salt Box. And the Salt Box, if you've seen, southern photos, it's a little shack house with the roof is short on one end and long on the other. Because that's where
what kind of box?
Salt Box house.
How you spell it?
Salt Box.
SALT?
So, and the book was finished, and it was going to print, and I was at McDowell Colony writing, and my editor emailed me, and she said, marketing doesn't like this title. And I was very angry because I had written the book with that title in mind, and so I said, well, let me, think about it. And when I got home, I had a bulletin board over my computer, and there was this little piece of paper where I had written "Nowhere is a Place." I don't know where it came from, why I had written it down, and that's how the title changed.
Any other questions?
Got to be other questions.
This is your chance.
What was it about the O'Keeffe book that kept you writing 20 hours a day? Did you have a deadline?
I did have a deadline. I was asked to write that book right after she died, and I was told that there were 4 other people writing books about her. And my book had to come out first or within 6 months of the first book, or it would not be reviewed. So I did, and it was a good thing that I was told that. So I didn't know what the deadline was, but I just knew that I had to be first. And if I hadn't been given that deadline, I would still be writing that book. I would still be doing research and finding more things. So it was a good thing. But also, I can't write fiction the way I can write nonfiction. Nonfiction, you're given a deadline, you're given a task, and you can make yourself do it. It's like writing a paper. You can stay up all night and finish it. Fiction just doesn't work that way. And I know that we all use that as an excuse for not finishing our books, but it's also true that you can push yourself, and it still doesn't come.
You need the muses to come down.
Something. It's so I could write 20 hours a day on that, and even with the end of a novel, I'm not quite that crazed with fiction.
Yes?
I loved your
Thank you.
do you have any more nonfiction books that you, or are you on the fiction side of things now?
It's hard to say. There are a couple of books, biographies I would like to write, but but before I get to them, another novel sort of starts bubbling up, and so I don't know if I will get to them. Who can say?
I wanted to ask all the panelists if they're working on something else, if they can tell us something about it, but also to give Elizabeth a chance to tell us about the book that she's having published in the spring.
Oh. And I wanted to ask them about covers. Since we talked about titles, I wanted to talk. Well, which one do you want?
A memoir.
Oh, I mean, which question did you want to go first? Yeah, I've just finished a memoir. It's very strange. It's very strange. When I tell people that the memoir is only 4 days, occurs over 4 days, they say, well, that can't be a memoir. But it sort of is. It's called Not for Everyday Use. And it starts from the moment I get the call that every immigrant fears. Comes at a time and a day that you know you're not getting a call. And you get it, and you know this is it. To my return to Trinidad, and when I get there, my mother had died. When I got the call, she was in the hospital by the time I got there. the next morning she had died that night, to her burial. So that's it. Just goes just like that. And I didn't know what I was doing. I didn't know how this could work. I didn't have that plan. That was nowhere in the plan. It just started, and it worked for me. It took a lot out of me to write it, because I never thought about writing a memoir, as a matter of fact. It was just, I'll tell you why I wrote the memoir. And it was because I had done something. The Folger Shakespeare Library had a project called Shakespeare's Sisters, and they picked 12 writers to write sort of Virginia Woolf from what Virginia Woolf said about Shakespeare's sisters, and they asked each of us to write a piece, and I wrote a piece, and in the piece I guess I said something about my life, and the editor said, you need to write a memoir. You should develop this. You should write, and so that's kind of where it started. So it's coming out at the end of March, and what can I say? I hope you read it. I hope I come back to you. I'm glad I did it. It's so. I'm one of 11, and there are things that what I'm saying about my life affects the rest of the family. So I had to be cautious as to what I said. And it so happened that after my mother died, life changed for us 360 degrees, if that's possible to believe. So it was good that I ended it there, even though I hadn't planned it, so I can write another memoir. Life changed for us. So that's my answer. What about the rest of you? What are you working on? I must add, something miraculous happened. Because you finish a book, like a year while it goes into production, or 9 months. And I just started to write a novel. And I finished the first draft. Oh, wow. But it's very scary. I'm calling my friend in Toronto, and I said, every day, I'm writing. I'm writing for hours and hours and hours. And then I said to her, I've finished it. I'm so scared of this book that I put it down. I'm going to pick it up next month and see what I have, because it's just a mystery. Yeah.
I'm working on another historical novel, and interestingly about this book, which I'm still kind of surprised about, is all of my books, well, all of the main characters in my novels are women, and with this particular novel, it's 2 men. And so I put up on Facebook a few months ago, I said, I have 2 men in my life and I'm totally in love with them. And so everybody came back, really, 2? And it's like, it's my book. So that's what I'm working on.
Yes, I'm working on the second novel. My grandfather was theatre manager of 2 theatres in Belfast, and I never met him, but I inherited an autograph book of all the music hall acts that passed through his theatres, and they weren't A-list, they weren't B-list, they weren't even C-list. And I thought, this is fantastic, the stories behind these people, so I have a fictional married double act. And really what I'm interested in is writing about exile and the dispossessed and the disintegration of family. So I don't know where it's going, I don't have a title, but I'm a good bit into it. What's worrying me a little bit more is I've been asked to reimagine a James Joyce story for a collection coming out next year, and with other Irish writers, and I'm terrified of that. I have to think about that on the plane on the way home, but it's quite a daunting task. How can you rework a Joyce story? But so I'll set my mind to that on the journey home. It's the story that I've chosen is Clay, as part of Dubliners. Yeah.
I have a novel that will be coming out in 2015 that I'm writing now. Right now it's called Cruel, Beautiful World, and I'm really superstitious about talking about stuff, so all I can say is that it's based in the time when the 60s, all the Back to the Land movement and the Flower Children era started to veer into the Mansons and Altamont, and things started to turn ugly.
I'm pretty too.
I don't talk about what I'm working on. It's sort of it's like letting the air out of a balloon if you talk about it. And my favorite quote about this was Ian McEwan, who was being interviewed by Deborah Solomon for the New York Times. And she said, can you tell us what you're working on now? And he said, no, I don't talk about that. And she said, can you give us a hint? And he said, not really. And she said, could you just tell us if it's set today? And he said, it's set today. And he said, shh, damn, now I have to start over. So I won't say a word.
I can barely describe Help for the Haunted, so I'm not ready to describe what I'm writing now, but I am writing something new. I don't.
Yeah.
I'll
But that's true. You leave you let the air out of the balloon when you talk about what you until I can tell you about the memo because it's done. It's in production. It's finished. Yeah. If there aren't any more questions, I hope you will run off and purchase the books of our writers. Because I just want to end with this little anecdote in a way. Sonia Sanchez, I heard her speak one day and people were crowded around her. And she said, she just turned aside and looked at me and she said, do they know that at any minute they can kill me off? And I pulled her aside and I said, what do you mean? She says, they just don't buy my books and that's the end of me. That's how they censor me. And then she said, look at them, they have on $125 sneakers. And I tell them, get my $25 book, and they do. So, did I shame you? Did I make you feel guilty? Open your wallets. And thank you so much for being here and this wonderful time.